We heard you bought a penthouse. We came to live with you and make peace, my son and daughter-in-law said at the doorstep. But when they entered the apartment, they froze. They were speechless at what they saw. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I was humming softly as I lifted the last fragile teacup from the box, cradling it like a relic of a past I had fought to preserve. At 66, the penthouse felt like a monument to my life, not just a home, but a statement. I had endured, I had survived, and I had finally carved a space where my choices reigned unquestioned. The walls, still smelling faintly of fresh paint, reflected the golden light of the afternoon sun, casting long, serene shadows across the polished hardwood floors. The city sprawled below in its usual ceaseless pulse, indifferent to the victories or defeats of those above it. Here, for the first time in decades, I felt untouchable, insulated from the weight of other people's expectations. My hands, slightly shaky with age, but precise from years of delicate work, arranged the teacups in their display case, lining them in a meticulous order that pleased me more than any compliment ever could. The phone buzzed against the marble countertop, abrupt and jarring, pulling me from the quiet cadence of my own thoughts. I glanced at it, recognizing Jason's name, and my chest constricted in a way that had nothing to do with age. Even after years apart, the sight of his number triggered a cocktail of nostalgia and unease. I pressed the button and answered, my voice calm, neutral. "Hello, Jason." "We'll be there in 10, he said. No hello, no small talk. Just a statement that felt like a declaration of intent. My brow furrowed, the gentle tension in my shoulders tightening. Something was coming, and it was not casual. I set the phone down, the silence that followed suddenly too loud, too immediate, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. Moments later, less than 10, though it felt longer, a knock came at the door, sharp and deliberate. I paused, my hand frozen on the teacup, the wood grain beneath my fingers suddenly alien. My heartbeat accelerated. The knock came again, impatient this time, and then a third, insistent, as though whatever had summoned them here refused to be denied. I opened the door slowly, allowing the light from the corridor to spill into my sanctuary. And there they were, Jason with his nervous half-smile, and Emily, her posture stiff, her eyes wide but unreadable. Each carried a suitcase that could have contained weeks of living, their presence immediately declaring permanence. The air seemed to thicken between us, and I realized in that heartbeat that I had not been prepared for this, not really. Jason spoke first, and his words cut into the calm I had cultivated for months. "We heard you bought a penthouse. We came to live with you and make peace." His smile was practiced, hesitant, almost pleading, but it failed to mask the underlying tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the handles of the suitcase like he might drop them or throw them if the words were rejected. I blinked, twice. My mind struggled to process the sentence fully. Make peace? The words hung in the doorway, heavy and unfamiliar, as though someone had dropped a foreign object in my living room and expected me to adopt it instantly. After years of barely speaking, after months of calculated distance and careful emotional preservation, this sudden declaration seemed like an intrusion of impossible audacity. I measured them carefully, noting the subtle signals they were giving, the slight tremor in Emily's fingers, the anxious shift of Jason's weight from one foot to another, the way he avoided meeting my eyes directly. There was something rehearsed in their approach, yet also an unspoken desperation that belied their casual phrasing. I felt a mixture of shock and suspicion, a twisting knot in my chest. Their words implied goodwill, a desire for reconciliation, yet the suddenness, the formality of their arrival, spoke of ulterior motives I could not yet name. I stepped aside without a word, letting the door remain open, not yet inviting them in fully, testing the weight of their intent against the boundaries I had so painstakingly built. Their silence filled the space, thick and expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I watched them hesitate, unsure of how to proceed, and in that pause, I felt the first flicker of control return to me. This was still my space, my penthouse, my life. Yet beneath that flicker, an undercurrent of anxiety persisted, the same anxiety that had followed me for years whenever family, those I loved and feared, appeared unannounced. What had they expected to find here? A lonely old woman, humbled by age and circumstance? Or were they testing me, calculating whether I had truly claimed the autonomy they had once ignored? The thought made my hands clench lightly around the edge of the doorframe, my knuckles pale against the polished wood. I inhaled slowly, letting the scent of fresh paint and polished wood fill my lungs, reminding myself that this moment, like all others, was mine to navigate. I met Jason's eyes finally, and though my voice was steady, my mind buzzed with cautious anticipation. "Go on," I said. "Come in. Let's see what peace looks like." And for the first time in years, the silence shifted, heavy with possibilities I wasn't yet ready to define. I led them across the threshold, my hand brushing the polished wood of the doorframe as if to assert my claim over the space. The city hummed faintly beyond the tall windows, but inside, the penthouse was a bubble of carefully curated light, shadow, and objects that told a story only I could fully comprehend. I watched their first steps falter, the hesitation spreading across their features like a visible ripple. And then it happened. They froze. Emily's lips parted as if to speak, then snapped shut again, leaving her suspended in an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. Jason's posture stiffened, the knuckles of his hands whitening as he clutched his suitcase like a talisman, a physical anchor in the face of something he could not immediately categorize. They were caught, suspended between expectation and reality, and I stood just behind them, silent, almost savoring the moment. For decades, I had existed in the periphery of their lives, a background figure they glanced at but never truly saw. And now here, at 66, I was unavoidable, undeniable, unignorable. I could see their eyes scanning the space, darting from one detail to the next, as though trying to reconstruct the life of the woman they thought they knew. The gleaming hardwood floors reflected the afternoon sun, polished so meticulously that every movement of their bodies seemed mirrored, exaggerated, and therefore impossible to ignore. Emily's gaze fell on the wall of books I had amassed over decades. They were not the careful selection of a casual reader. Each title had been chosen, nurtured, and preserved. She traced the spines with her eyes, a subtle gesture of reverence mixed with disbelief. Jason's attention lingered on the assortment of paintings I had collected in quiet moments of independence. Landscapes from trips I had taken alone, abstract pieces that had whispered to me in galleries while life continued its relentless pace outside my own orbit. Their shock wasn't just about the aesthetics. It was the realization that the life I had built had been fully mine, and that I had done it without their involvement or approval, without waiting for permission that had never come. I could see Emily's hands begin to tremble slightly, a subtle but undeniable reaction, and the suitcase slipped from her grasp, thudding against the polished floor. The sound echoed faintly, almost like punctuation to the tableau of their hesitation. Jason didn't drop his. He held on with a rigid grip, as if letting go might unravel the fragile pretense of control he had assumed he possessed. And I let them stand there for long moments, absorbing their immobility, savoring the realization that I had achieved something they could not anticipate or diminish. Finally, my small, deliberate smile appeared, a quiet acknowledgement of the power shift that had taken place, unspoken yet absolute. "Go on," I said, my voice calm but firm, carrying through the space like a quiet bell toll. "Look around." They did slowly, as though the room itself were a labyrinth revealing its secrets in increments. And in truth, that was exactly what it was. This was not just a penthouse. It was a chronicle of survival, independence, and defiance. Every corner had a story. The antique sideboard from my mother's estate spoke of heritage and memory. The small sculpture by the window, catching the sunlight, was a token of a moment when I had traveled alone, braving a city I did not yet understand, carving out a life for myself. Even the rugs and cushions, carefully arranged, were markers of patience, taste, and deliberate choices. Decisions made in the silence of years when no one was watching, no one offering guidance, no one caring enough to understand the labor behind them. Their eyes moved from object to object, scanning the space with a mixture of disbelief and unspoken questions. I could sense their mental gears turning. How did she? When did she? What does this mean for me? The air was thick with tension, with the realization that they had underestimated not just me, but the entirety of the life I had lived outside their perception. Their freeze was not only at the visual spectacle, it was at the weight of it, the undeniable evidence that I had thrived, prospered, and created a world of depth, richness, and autonomy entirely my own. I let the silence stretch, a slow, deliberate pressure that drew attention to their astonishment. Each second confirmed the separation between past assumptions and present reality. Here was a woman they had thought they knew, a mother, a wife, a figure in the background of their lives, standing at the center of a life that was fully, irreversibly hers. And in that freeze, in that moment of awestruck hesitation, I understood that this penthouse was more than a home. It was proof. I had survived. I had built. I had been seen. Not by them, not until now, but certainly by me. I watched them carefully, observing the subtle shift in their expressions, the almost imperceptible tightening of Emily's jaw, the way Jason's gaze flickered across the room as though trying to locate the invisible boundaries of what they thought they knew about me. Their shock had faded into something more complicated. Questions, judgments, silent calculations. I could see the thoughts forming behind their eyes, a constellation of disbelief and reevaluation. They had expected a sterile, lifeless space, perhaps even a small, modest apartment reflective of what they had assumed was my quiet, forgotten existence. And instead, they encountered a life lived deliberately, fully, and without compromise. The walls were not bare. They were canvases of memory and proof. Paintings from my travels caught the sunlight streaming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, each brushstroke a story, a decision made on my own, away from the prying or dismissive eyes that had often judged my choices. The colors were vivid yet balanced, a visual representation of the patience and discernment I had cultivated over decades of independence. Every piece had been selected not for approval, not for admiration, but because it resonated with me. Their eyes lingered, hesitant, as if they were trying to read a book written in a language they had never learned. The shelves, stacked meticulously with books of every kind, reflected a hunger for knowledge and experience that no one had ever tried to nourish. I remembered late nights alone in cramped apartments, poring over pages, absorbing ideas, living worlds beyond my own. These books were more than decoration. They were the architecture of my mind, the scaffolding of a life I had constructed quietly, without audience or applause. And here they were, staring at the physical evidence of years of curiosity, discipline, and solitary triumph. Awards set discreetly on the corner table, plaques from volunteer work, recognition for achievements I had pursued in silence, quietly without fanfare. These honors were not trophies for vanity. They were markers of persistence, small yet significant victories against invisibility, against the habitual overlooking that had accompanied my role as just Teresa, the woman everyone knew existed, but never truly acknowledged. The penthouse itself, the sweeping open space, the way sunlight fell across polished floors and strategically placed objects, it was all a declaration that I had survived, and not just survived, but had flourished in a life crafted entirely on my terms. And yet, as I took it all in, while observing their frozen stares, the unspoken calculations in their eyes, I felt a quiet ache. Not anger, not resentment exactly, though traces of both curled like shadows around the edges of my consciousness. It was the ache of being invisible in plain sight, of having lived a life alongside people who never looked closely enough to see me. These were my son and daughter-in-law, people who had once shared my daily existence, who had slept under the same roof and eaten at the same table, yet had barely glimpsed the woman who had carried, endured, and created all of this. Their surprise was not just at the penthouse. It was at the realization that I had a life outside of them, a life they had long ignored, a life that existed independent of their validation or recognition. I felt a small, almost imperceptible tightening behind my ribs, a reminder of all those years of unnoticed effort, of being cataloged as background noise rather than the agent of my own story. I remembered the moments I had quietly celebrated victories alone, the silent triumphs of planning a trip, completing a project, mastering a skill, all the moments that had been invisible to those I had once loved most. And here they were, staring at the cumulative evidence of those decades, their expressions unreadable, caught somewhere between admiration, guilt, and discomfort. There was a subtle, almost ironic satisfaction in the tension, in the knowledge that they could no longer casually underestimate me. And yet that satisfaction was bittersweet. I had built this life for myself, yes, but the ache lingered, a reminder that validation from them had never come, that my value had been silently doubted, overlooked, or minimized. Their silence was a reflection not only of shock, but of the decades of assumption and ignorance that had defined my relationship with them. I let them take in the space for a few more moments, watching as Emily's eyes softened slightly when she noticed the carefully preserved photographs of family moments long past, and Jason's posture relaxed fractionally as he took in the subtle elegance of my arrangement, the balance of function and beauty in every corner. Their astonishment, mingled with a dawning awareness, made my chest tighten, not with triumph alone, but with the quiet pain of all that had gone unseen. I finally spoke, my voice calm but steady, a statement of quiet truth. This is my life. Every piece of it is mine. Not yours, not anyone else's. Mine. They nodded slowly, absorbing the words, the weight, the subtle defiance that lingered behind the surface calm of my tone. And in that moment, as they stood in awe, I felt the bittersweet duality of pride and sorrow, the quiet ache of being finally seen, though long overdue. The first morning after they arrived, I woke to the faint hum of conversation that quickly grated on my nerves. Jason's voice, once so casual in my old house, now felt invasive, territorial, as though he had somehow acquired the right to critique my life simply by crossing the threshold. I poured coffee and carried it to the living room, where my record player sat quietly in the corner, an extension of my morning ritual, a fragment of the calm and order I had cultivated. "Mom," Jason began, his tone teetering between irritation and faux politeness. "Do you have to play the record so loud? I can hear everything from the kitchen." I paused, the mug warming my hands, and felt the first prickling of anger. So this is how it begins, I thought. Not reconciliation, not even acknowledgement. They want control. My eyes swept the living room, deliberately taking in the furniture, the careful placement of objects, the light falling exactly where I intended. Every item, every arrangement was a statement. I had done this alone, and I had done it deliberately. Yet here they were, as though the penthouse were theirs to judge. Emily's comments were no better. By mid-morning she was moving cushions, pointing out angles, murmuring critiques about my choice of rugs and the alignment of the books on the shelves. "Teresa, don't you think it would feel more open if you moved the sofa closer to the window?" she asked, her voice sweet but insufferably condescending. The words stung in a way I hadn't anticipated, the subtle suggestion that my decades of decision-making were flawed, that I needed their guidance to make my own home livable. A surge of anger rose in me, sharp and unwelcome, but I let it simmer, focusing on my breathing. At 66, I had learned to channel impulses carefully, to weigh my reactions. But this was not a minor irritation. This was a direct assault on the life I had fought to build. Every misplaced comment, every tentative suggestion felt like a hand reaching for the hard-won boundaries of my autonomy. I felt the blood rushing behind my ears, a heat that I hadn't experienced since my younger, more fiery days. It wasn't just irritation, it was betrayal. For decades, I had been overlooked, my opinions minimized, my ambitions deferred. And now, here were Jason and Emily, masquerading as peacemakers, and instead asserting a quiet dominion over the space that symbolized my independence. My penthouse, my sanctuary, had become an arena of subtle aggression, and I could feel the buried hatred. Old wounds reopening, memories of years in which my voice had been ignored, dismissed, or silenced, coiling tightly in my chest. The tension was a constant, simmering presence. Each day, the complaints and suggestions felt like chipping away at the walls I had constructed around myself, walls built from years of careful effort, discipline, and silent victories. When Jason fiddled with the thermostat, claiming it was too cold, or when Emily questioned the placement of my grandmother's heirlooms, I felt a prickling fury that made my fingers tighten into fists at my sides. They had not come to reconcile. They had come to assert authority, to occupy a space that I had painstakingly earned, and in doing so, they assumed the right to judge, to diminish, to intrude. I began to notice the subtler provocations too, the looks exchanged when I wasn't paying attention, the quiet sighs of disapproval when I moved from one room to another, the whispered assessments of my cooking, my taste, my habits. It was relentless, a barrage that wore down the edges of patience I had nurtured over decades. I realized with clarity, a bitter crystalline clarity, that their presence was not about healing or connection. It was about possession, about subtly reclaiming the mother they had long disregarded, turning her life into an extension of their comfort and judgment. And yet, within that anger, a spark of determination burned. This was my life, built over decades of struggle, patience, and unacknowledged effort. At 66, I had finally claimed something unequivocally my own, and no critique, no criticism, no implied judgment would make me relinquish it. My blood boiled, but it was tempered by clarity. They could attempt to intrude, attempt to belittle, but they could not erase the labor, the resilience, or the independence that this penthouse embodied. I felt the buried hatred growing, a slow, relentless energy beneath the surface, not mindless rage, but a focused protective force. It was aimed not at fleeting frustrations, but at the persistent disrespect, the unspoken dismissal of a life that had been mine alone. They had come to make peace, and instead, they had unearthed years of quiet defiance and pride, years of silent victories that now demanded recognition, if not from them, then from the world itself. As the day wore on, I moved through the apartment deliberately, reclaiming the space in small, deliberate gestures, adjusting the throw pillows exactly as I preferred, placing the records on the turntable, arranging the cushions just so. Each act was a reaffirmation. This life was mine, every detail chosen, every moment preserved, and no interference could diminish it. My heart pounded with the tension of anger, but also with the fierce satisfaction of ownership. At 66, I was standing fully in the life I had created, and if they wanted to challenge it, they would have to face not only the walls and the art and the furniture, but the woman who had built them. It was late evening, and the apartment was bathed in the warm, honeyed light of the setting sun, the kind that spilled across the polished floors and gilded edges of frames like quiet forgiveness. I had been in the kitchen, rearranging some teacups I had retrieved from a box that had been unpacked days ago, when I noticed Emily sitting cross-legged on the sofa, a photo album spread across her lap. I froze for a moment, uncertain if I should approach or retreat. There was a tension in her posture, but it was different from the tension of judgment or intrusion. It was hesitant, almost reverent. She was looking at the photographs with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Her fingers lingered over images of me from decades past. A young woman laughing on a crowded beach, bundled in scarves on a winter sidewalk, standing beside a modest apartment I had once called home. Her lips moved slightly, whispering something I couldn't immediately hear. I stepped closer, curiosity mingling with a cautious hope. I never realized, she whispered finally, her voice trembling, the words almost swallowed by the quiet hum of the city outside. How much you went through, Mom. I didn't see you. I stood in the doorway, my heart stirring, an unfamiliar warmth threading through the knot of anger and pride I had carried for days. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the rawness of her admission, and for the first time in days, I felt the walls I had built around my frustration shift slightly. Emily was not speaking to accuse or to critique. She was speaking to confess. Jason appeared a moment later, leaning against the frame of the kitchen doorway, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jeans. The corners of his mouth twitched as though he wanted to smile, but restraint held him in check. I wasn't honest with you either, he said quietly, voice low and careful. I was scared, Teresa. Scared of your independence. Scared that you had outgrown us. I blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability that had slipped through the protective shell he had worn since stepping into my penthouse. It wasn't malice I saw in his expression. It was insecurity, a quiet fear that I had moved beyond their understanding, that my life, my choices, my space had grown vast and untouchable. There was longing in his eyes, too, a subtle ache to belong, to connect, to reclaim a bond they had never fully nurtured before. I sank into the armchair across from Emily, feeling a sudden exhaustion, not of the body, but of the defenses I had maintained. My anger, so sharp and hot these past days, felt different now, tempered by recognition. It had been fueled not just by their intrusion, by the criticisms and complaints that pricked at my pride, but also by the solitude I had carried for so long. My penthouse had been a monument to survival, yes, but also a space where I had built boundaries against loneliness, against misunderstanding. And now, for the first time in a long time, those walls were being approached not with judgment, but with tentative understanding. Emily wiped at her eyes, lips quivering. "I always thought I knew you, Mom. I thought I understood the quiet life you lived here, but I didn't. I never saw the struggles, the triumphs, the everything." Her voice faltered, heavy with unspoken remorse. "I thought independence meant distance, not courage." I let out a slow breath, feeling a curious lightness in my chest. The layers of resentment, the simmering anger that had taken residence in me for days, did not vanish instantly. But they softened, folded into an awareness that perhaps they had not been entirely blind to me. Merely unprepared, untrained, unsure how to witness the woman I had become. I realized that my fury had always been intertwined with my own wounds, the loneliness, the years of unacknowledged effort, the quiet assertion of self that had been so easily misconstrued as pride or stubbornness. Jason moved closer, seating himself beside Emily, and reached for my hand in a gesture that startled me with its tentative intimacy. "I'm sorry, Teresa. I didn't see you when I should have. I thought I was protecting you by keeping my distance, but maybe I was only protecting myself from realizing how much you had grown without us." I felt a subtle shift in the air, a fragile bridge forming between past grievances and present recognition. My chest tightened, but this time with something more akin to relief than tension. I had imagined their intrusion as an assault on my autonomy, but perhaps it was a reflection of their own insecurities, their own fears of inadequacy. Their comments, their critiques, had been misguided attempts to engage with a life they had not yet understood. I smiled faintly, carefully, letting a trace of warmth seep into the room. "It's not just you," I said softly, voice steadier than I felt. "I've been angry, yes, but mostly because I have lived so long being overlooked, even by those closest to me. You weren't wrong to be cautious. You just didn't see the life I've built, and I've held on to it fiercely because it's mine." Emily nodded, wiping another tear, and Jason's grip on my hand tightened slightly, not possessively, but as though acknowledging a shared understanding. In that quiet living room, amidst the warm glow of the sunset and the gentle scent of brewed coffee, something shifted. The sharp edges of anger dulled, replaced by a complex awareness. Love intertwined with fear, pride entwined with humility, pain softened by recognition. I realized then, with a clarity that surprised me, that forgiveness did not have to be grand or immediate. It could begin here, in this quiet exchange, in the acknowledgement of truth and vulnerability. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that something, subtle, delicate, and fiercely alive, had started to move between us. The days that followed were quiet, but in that quiet, a subtle transformation began to take shape. I found myself noticing the small gestures, the hesitant touches of consideration, the tiny acknowledgments that had been missing for decades. Jason had taken to helping me move furniture, not because I asked, but because he seemed to understand, at last, that this space was mine, that every placement, every line of sight carried intention and memory. Together, we shifted the sofa a few inches to allow more sunlight into the corner where I kept my reading chair. The act was simple, almost banal, but the way he consulted me with each adjustment, waiting for my nod, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't allowed in years. I realized with a quiet astonishment that I hadn't expected this. I hadn't imagined that collaboration could feel like respect rather than intrusion. Emily, too, began to reveal a different side of herself, the one I had only glimpsed in fleeting moments long ago. One evening, she insisted on preparing dinner, though her hands trembled slightly as she chopped vegetables and stirred sauces. The aroma filled the penthouse, rich and warm, and I felt my defenses lowering as I watched her move with care, almost reverence, around the kitchen I had once thought of as my sanctuary. When she placed the meal on the table, her eyes met mine, and I saw both pride and fear reflected there. It was as if she feared rejection, feared that her care might be mistaken for overreach, and yet she tried anyway. I tasted the first bite of her labor, and it carried the weight of her intention, the quiet effort to nurture, to connect, to bridge the chasm that had grown between us. I was not untouched by the past. Memories surfaced, unbidden, the days when they had lived with me long ago, the subtle slights, the misunderstandings, the silences that had piled into walls around my heart. And yet, for the first time in decades, I felt those walls beginning to crumble, not shattered by anger, but softened by recognition. I could see their mistakes, yes, but also their humanity. I could see myself, too, in a new light, my own stubbornness, my own pride, my own hesitations that had built barriers just as formidable. Compassion was seeping into the cracks, slowly, imperceptibly, but steadily. One morning we all sat in the sunlit corner of the living room, sipping coffee, the city humming faintly below us. Jason had moved my favorite armchair closer to the windows, just as I liked it, and Emily had brought cushions and a small tray of pastries she had baked herself. There was no grand announcement, no declaration of peace. It was quieter than that. It was in the ease with which we existed in the same space, the subtle attentiveness, the shared glances and half-smiles that carried more meaning than words. I found myself laughing softly at something Jason said, a joke, really, but one that felt less like teasing and more like genuine warmth, and Emily smiled, a shy, almost reluctant expression that soon blossomed into something freer. For the first time, I allowed myself to recognize that this penthouse, the space I had fought so hard to claim as mine, could also be a space of shared presence. The walls that had once felt like shields now seemed less rigid, more porous, as if they could absorb understanding and trust. I realized that independence did not have to be isolation, that strength did not preclude intimacy. And I began to see Jason and Emily not as intruders, not as critics, but as human beings who had been caught in the same fear and misunderstanding that I had carried for years. That evening, Emily lingered in the kitchen after dinner, quietly wiping down counters, her movements careful, deliberate. I watched her, noting the effort she had put into learning my routines, my preferences, the unspoken rhythms of this home that had always belonged to me. I felt a wave of tenderness, a recognition that care need not be grandiose to be profound. Jason, meanwhile, had settled on the balcony, surveying the city lights with a rare ease, and I sensed his gratitude, not just for the space, but for the opportunity to be part of it without contention. Compassion, I realized, was not instantaneous. It was not a switch to be flipped. It grew in the small acts of consideration, in the quiet acknowledgement of one another's presence, in the careful listening and tentative giving of space. I allowed myself to feel it in waves, letting it fill the corners of my penthouse and the corners of my heart. I did not pretend that the past was erased, that the years of distance and misunderstanding had vanished. But I began to see that our future, our shared presence in this space, could be shaped not by old grievances, but by this new, fragile understanding. And in that, there was a subtle triumph, a gentle victory. Not over them, not over my own solitude, but over the fear that life after 66 would be defined solely by what had been denied, rather than by what could still be nurtured. The penthouse was no longer just a testament to survival. It was becoming, quietly, a home of tentative connection, where compassion was allowed to grow, fragile and steady, into something real. Months had passed since that first tense knock at the door, and the penthouse had transformed in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. It wasn't just the physical arrangement that had changed, the sofa angled to catch the sunlight just so, Emily's small herb garden thriving on the balcony, but the atmosphere itself. It breathed differently now, lighter, infused with the kind of warmth that comes from mutual respect and slow forgiveness. Laughter no longer felt like an intrusion. It was a thread woven into the fabric of the apartment, a sound that belonged here as naturally as the hum of the city below. Jason had settled into a rhythm I could recognize, a rhythm that respected the boundaries I had so carefully built over the years, while allowing his own presence to be felt without guilt or contention. He still hummed while preparing coffee in the mornings, a habit that had once annoyed me when it sounded in my quiet kitchen, but now it felt like a companionable punctuation to the start of the day. I could see him in the living room, absorbed in a book, occasionally glancing up to make eye contact and share a quiet smile. Those looks carried something unspoken, acknowledgement, gratitude, and a shared history that had been difficult to reclaim, but now felt tangible in the small gestures and silent agreements of cohabitation. Emily had grown more confident in the space, shedding her initial hesitancy like a cloak she no longer needed. She arranged the shelves, subtly shifting the placement of objects in ways that complemented my own choices, never overriding them, but enhancing them. Watching her, I understood that her careful attentiveness wasn't control. It was love and a desire to contribute to a home she had once feared she had no place in. One night, I found her laughing over a spilled saucepan, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and something inside me swelled with a quiet joy. These moments, trivial in isolation, now felt monumental. Markers of a family learning to exist together without resentment, without the weight of old fears. The penthouse itself seemed to respond to the shift. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows with a gentleness that highlighted every artifact I had collected over the decades, paintings from distant cities, photographs of long-ago adventures, awards that marked personal triumphs. Each object had once been a solitary testament to survival, to a life I had built alone. Now they felt shared, almost celebratory, a silent acknowledgement that the victories of one could be appreciated by many. The space no longer represented isolation or defiance. It had become a home in the fullest sense, a vessel for connection, memory, and love. One evening, I found myself on the balcony, wrapped in a shawl against the crisp night air, watching the city lights shimmer like scattered jewels across the skyline. The city had always been beautiful from this height, but tonight it felt different. The glow of neon signs and street lamps was bright, yes, but it was nothing compared to the light that now filled my heart. I felt it radiating inward from the small, quiet successes of the past months, the shared meals, the arguments that ended in understanding rather than resentment, the tender glances exchanged over coffee tables and kitchen counters. The light came from Jason, finally unafraid to respect my independence while asserting his own. From Emily, who had learned to navigate this delicate new space with grace and courage. From the bonds that had once frayed and now hummed with cautious but steady life. I thought about the years I had spent believing that peace might be unattainable, that my independence required solitude, that my heart could survive without the recognition of those I loved most. And yet here I was, 66 years old, finally inhabiting a life that was fully mine and paradoxically fully shared. I realized that the pride I had carried for so long, the stubbornness that had shielded me from both hurt and vulnerability, was no longer a barrier. It had softened into resilience that could coexist with tenderness, a strength that did not exclude intimacy. Below, the city pulsed with motion, with lives intersecting in ways I would never see, yet I felt a connection, a quiet understanding that my own life had reached a kind of equilibrium. The laughter of my son and daughter-in-law echoed faintly from the living room, carried on the subtle hum of the apartment. It was imperfect, tentative, but it was real. And that reality, messy, beautiful, unpredictable, was precisely what I had fought for, what I had nearly given up on, and what I had finally earned. As I stood there, gazing out over the sparkling cityscape, I let myself feel it fully, the pride in what I had built alone, the joy of what I had allowed to grow alongside me, and the serenity that comes from knowing that even at 66, life could still surprise me with the richness of belonging. The penthouse was more than walls and windows now. It was a living testament to resilience, to love, to the quiet victories of understanding. I breathed in deeply, letting the night air mingle with the glow that came not from the city, but from inside, from a family reunited, from peace finally realized, from the luminous heart of a life reclaimed and shared.